Did you know that Islam once had something a lot like the Library of Alexandria? It's true. It's called the House of Wisdom, and it was a library turned research and translation center located in the city of Baghdad, of all places. Yeah, that Baghdad from Iraq War fame. Well, safe to say it was a little different a long time ago, and we're going to talk about that and a whole lot more here on today's episode of the American Cold War on Cut to the Chase. Welcome back to the channel. If you like today's video, please leave a comment. If you want to see more, please subscribe, and also follow me over on X. I appreciate you guys stopping by today. Let's get right to the video. The time of the Abbasids covers the largest span of time we've discussed on this channel yet. It's going to leap us forward more than 700 years in the timeline. Though the last 200 to 250 years were a bit of a shell of former glory. And it's really only the first 100 years or so that can really truly be referred to as the Golden Age. Throughout this era, though, Islam continues to be a world-shaping force, but it is increasingly plagued by internal fighting and rivalries. After centuries advancing across Christian lands and raiding their coasts, Western Christendom finally launches a counterattack in the form of the infamous Crusades. This causes trouble in the heart of the Caliphate for nearly 200 years. Islam also very slowly but steadily lost ground in Spain in the west. And though they were fellow Muslims, the Abbasids lost much of their hard power, that being their military and political power, to the Seljuk Turks coming in from the east and the northeast. Ultimately, the Mongols would devastate the dynasty with the brutal sack of Baghdad in 1258. This would destroy the House of Wisdom and many of the works preserved within it. This effectively ended Abbasid power, and though a lesser branch would be reestablished in Egypt, Mamluk Egypt, a couple of years later, this shell of former Abbasid greatness would only continue until the Ottomans would conquer Cairo in 1517, and with it, claim the mantle and status of the one true caliphate. Many of the themes that we've been discussing in this mini-series are just as prevalent throughout this span of centuries as before, which includes the continued development of Islamic jurisprudence and the different schools of thought as far as how to apply Sharia on the lands controlled by Islam. It also includes constant warring against Christians and other bordering powers, the two-tiered society with Islam on top and the people of the book below, frequent and regular raids against the enemies of Islam to claim plunder and captives, and, unfortunately, slavery from multiple sources and for multiple purposes, and more. But we begin today with our discussion of the overthrow of the Umayyad powers, the Umayyad rulers, and the Abbasid revolution. Let's get started. Please also keep in mind this quick disclaimer that we are just barely going to scratch the surface today, especially since I'm really trying to work towards shortening these videos to make them more concise. So this, if I don't cover things as in-depth as you would prefer, maybe we can come back to it one day. But this video, we got a lot of ground to cover. For years, even decades, there was growing discontent with the Umayyads. As early as the year 718, Abbasid agents began a secret propaganda campaign to plant the seeds of revolution, promising to restore true Islamic governance, equality for all Muslims, and rule by the Prophet's family. This appealed to both Sunni and Shia Muslims. Different groups felt different grievances, but the most important were, number one, discrimination against non-Arab Muslims. So the Umayyads were an Arab supremacist regime. They put the Arabs on top and passed a number of policies to keep them there, to really make that Arab supremacy felt. Especially if you were from Syria, where their base of power was. So these Arabs enjoyed privileges in government, high-ranking military commands and senior positions there, and tax exemptions, among other benefits, while non-Arab Muslim converts, particularly those from Mesopotamia, from Persia, and from Central Asia felt discriminated against by, number one, often being forced to pay the jizya, which is supposed to be something that only non-Muslims have to pay, specifically people of the book, Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, maybe one or two other exceptions here and there. But some of these converts that are not Arab are being made to continue to pay jizya. Number two, exclusion from senior positions in military and government. Number three, segregation in mosques during prayers. Number four, restrictions on intermarriage, so they weren't being allowed to intermarry with Arab Muslims. They had to intermarry with their own ethnicities. And number five, patron-client ties. So at least early on, there was kind of this situation a lot of the time, not always, but a lot of the time where if you wanted to convert, you couldn't just become a Muslim. You had to have someone who was already a Muslim become your sponsor. Well, you as a non-Arab Muslim convert, you basically had to surrender your rights, your self-determination to this sponsor, and you basically became their slave in order to become a Muslim. So this anger was particularly felt in the province of Khorasan, which is out in eastern Persia, kind of Afghanistan, maybe a little bit north of there, where converts had made great contributions to expanding the empire. The second major reason was religious and moral criticisms of Umayyad rule. So critics accused the Umayyads of abandoning the ideals of equality, justice, and piety, and saw them as worldly kings because they were doing a lot of indulging in things like luxuries, different luxuries of sorts, wine, which is a big taboo which is expressly forbidden in Islam, and practicing a lot of foreign customs in their courts, particularly Byzantine and Persian customs. The Abbasids, on the other hand, were presenting themselves as legitimate alternatives, being members of the same clan as the Prophet Muhammad, and claiming a direct descent from his uncle by the name of Abbas, from which they get their name Abbasids. They also took advantage of long-term Umayyad repression of the Shia, even though the Abbasids themselves were not really Shia. The third major reason is economic exploitation and unfair taxation. So heavy discriminatory taxes burdened non-Arabs and Mawali. So remember, non-Arab converts were called Mawali, while the Arab elites were often favored. So as we mentioned earlier, they were getting tax exemptions where the converts were being made to pay taxes, sometimes even the same tax that the non-Muslims were having to pay. Provinces often felt exploited. So a lot of this is coming into the Syrian core, because that's where the Umayyads, that's where Muawiyah was governor. That's where he set up his government there in Damascus. And this is where they continued for years and years and years. And so everything kind of out on the fringes is feeling like they're being taken advantage of. And all these resources are going all the way in. There's also a lot of corruption and nepotism and inefficiencies going on. So the fourth major reason is political and regional alienation, kind of what we're already talking about. There was also a lot of tribal rivalry amongst the different Arab tribes. So it's not just Arab against non-Arab. It's also rivalries within the Arab tribes. So this led to a lot of revolts and internal instability, and ultimately a third fitna in the year 744, or beginning in the year 744. That's right. In under, I guess, a little over 100 years, we have now had 3 major civil wars. Well, the Abbasids at this point saw their chance. So, it is the year 747. The third fitna is still in full swing, but now the Abbasids have found the moment to strike. So they raise their symbol, which is the black banner, which symbolizes mourning, and particularly mourning for the things that have happened to the family of Muhammad. But they raise it in the city of Merv, in the province of Khorasan, out there in the far east, the northeast of the caliphate. And they quickly, at this point, they'd, from 718 until 747, they'd been building, at this point, decades of build-up and support. So they quickly overwhelm the city, quickly overwhelm the entire province, and then gather their forces and start to march westward into eastern Persia. So they begin a steady advance, engaging in battle after battle over the next couple of years. And one key leader that is leading this effort is a guy by the name of Abu Muslim al-Khorasani. So obviously the last part of that name meaning, he's from Khorasan. But he is a Persian convert to Islam, and he is a very skilled general, and they win multiple battles under his command. And ultimately, they make their way into modern-day Iraq, into Mesopotamia, and they take the city of Kufa there in the south. So in late November of the year 749, the Abbasids finally, so it's not this general that's going to be their pick for their own caliph, they reveal a guy that would come to be called Al-Safa, which is actually a nickname. So a thing about the Abbasids that sets them apart from the Umayyads, at least to do with their name. So the Umayyads kind of did what more Western kings and monarchs did, where you would have like Edward III, George III. You have Muawiyah the first, Muawiyah the second, Marwan the first, Marwan the second. So they kind of do this like it's just their name and then their number in the line, however many else there's been, they're the next one. Well, the Abbasids have a little different pattern. They basically take nicknames, and these names all have a meaning. And it's not clear if they had these names while they were the caliph or if it was given to them sometime during their rule or even after their rule. But Al-Safa becomes the first caliph. So at the time, it's still in the middle of the war, so they've not taken over the caliphate yet. But now there are two caliphs at war. The Umayyad Caliph is Marwan II, and he leads an army into northern Mesopotamia, and the Abbasid forces meet him in what's called the Battle of the Zab, or the Battle of the Great Zab. And they being the Umayyads, are crushed. They are absolutely devastated. It's said, some reports say as many as 300 actual family members of the Umayyad clan are killed in the fighting in that one battle alone. Marwan II was there personally leading the forces, or at least observing the battle. I don't know if he was fighting or not. But it goes very poorly. They start losing a ton of men, and so he flees. And the Abbasids, win the day, and then they send a small detachment to follow him, to track him down. And he flees all the way to Egypt, into a small town in the Nile Delta there, where the Abbasids catch up with him, they find him, they capture him, and they kill him. And they send his head back to their commander, and with that, they begin an onslaught. They track down, now that they've gotten the caliph, the Umayyad caliph, they hunt down as many Umayyads as they can find, and they are brutal. They are slaughtering everyone they can find. They even set up at one point a banquet where they were luring them in, I should say, with offers of pardons for them. And you get kind of a red wedding situation going on here where they shut and lock the doors, everybody pulls out weapons, and they just go to town and kill like another 80 Umayyads in this one banquet alone. So it is such a thorough extermination that only one Umayyad of note survives. And that is a guy by the name of Abd al-Rahman, and he escapes. And he flees not just to Egypt, but he flees all the way to Muslim Spain. And he begins to set up his own independent Muslim power there. So that is in the year 750. He wouldn't get this really going and become Abd al-Rahman I, the Emir of Cordoba. That wouldn't happen until the year 756, a few years into the what is now the Abbasid Caliphate. But if I haven't confused you there, the Abbasids are successful in the revolution, and in the year 750, they officially become the ruling dynasty, replacing the Umayyads in true bloody fashion. A couple quick changes here. I've already mentioned the name changes. Al-Safa is the first caliph. He's not caliph for very long, so he doesn't really do a whole lot, but he does move the capital from Damascus to Mesopotamia, particularly to the city of Kufa, in the same year that they took over in 750. Well, then they begin construction of a new city That new city is something you may be more familiar with. That is the city of Baghdad. So in 762, it is complete enough that they move the center of government up to Baghdad. And Baghdad holds on to it until the year 836, when the city of Samarra is constructed and becomes the capital, and is there for a time until later that same century. In 892, they move it back to Baghdad, and it stays there. So you got a little bit of hopping around here, but you have this shift from Syria, which is a little bit more in the west. It's kind of central more so than west, but it shifts to Mesopotamia as kind of the center of government and of culture. And with that comes a shift away from Arab supremacy specifically, and they begin to kind of cast a wider net. They kind of open up their arms a little bit more. And Baghdad has been described, at least at this time, as a little bit more of a cosmopolitan city. So now you get Persians are starting to be treated more as equals. Turks and, all those different peoples from Central Asia and all over, all these people that had been experiencing all this discrimination under the Umayyads, even though they had converted, are now being treated on more or less equal footing as the universal brotherhood of Muslims. I shouldn't say Muslim Brotherhood because that's a very specific group a lot later in history. But they start to try to fulfill their promises that they had been campaigning on all this time, and they start to try to make things a little more fair, at least for Muslims of all backgrounds. We're not going to have time to go through every single caliph because they rule for a while, so there's a lot of caliphs that come and go. We've already mentioned the first one, though, so I'll mention the first couple here. So the first one was a guy by the name of Abu al-Abbas al-Safa. So he was the great-grandson of Muhammad's uncle. Are you confused yet by all the different family degrees of separation here? His nickname means either the generous or the shedder of blood, which, I don't know, maybe both of them apply to some degree. But he only rules until 754. So it then passes to a guy by the name of Al-Mansur, who becomes the second caliph, and he reigns for a little longer. So he takes it from 754 to 775, and they really get established under him. He is a little ruthless and has a couple challengers. So his own uncle tries to challenge him as he is ascending to the throne. So he throws his uncle in prison, a guy by the name of Abdullah ibn Ali. I'm probably butchering these names. So he is thrown in prison in 754 as a potential political rival, and stays there for a number of years until Al-Mansur gets tired of him and has him executed in 764. Well, also, even though he had been key to the Abbasid victory, Al-Mansur is a little wary of this Abu Muslim, this general that had been winning all these battles and a lot of popular support. So actually, shortly after he takes power, in the year 755, he has Abu Muslim al-Khurasani assassinated, fearing his growing power and influence. Well, as we mentioned, a couple years after that, you get way out in Spain and kind of Morocco, kind of northern Spain. The Emirate of Cordoba gets set up in 756, and the last Umayyad survivor, Abd al-Rahman, becomes Abd al-Rahman I, the first ruler, emir of that Cordoba, which becomes its own independent power. So under Muhammad, under the Rashidun, more or less, even though there was periods of civil war there, and under the Umayyads for the most part, even though there was also periods of civil conflict there, the Muslim world was more or less united. Well, as we go from Umayyads to Abbasids, that ends. From this point forward into history until our very day, there begin to be a number of Muslim nations. At different times, different ones are more allies to the primary caliphate. So the Abbasids are still viewed as predominantly the legitimate caliphate, and then eventually that will pass to the Ottomans after them. And then in our day, there actually is not one currently. But at this time, we start to see other rival Muslim states. And the first of those is this Emirate of Cordoba. So they are independent of the Abbasid Caliphate. and they will continue on for some time. So there's a new Umayyad dynasty, but this one's a little less powerful than the first. And they will eventually become a caliphate, or they will at least declare themselves a caliphate all their own. But the last thing he did was founding Baghdad in 762, and then we move on into the next era. Now we move into kind of what is the peak of the Golden Age, and this is from about 775 to 861. You get, we're going to start to skip over some of the leaders here. So the fifth, we've gone from the second to the fifth now. The fifth Abbasid Caliph is a guy by the name of Harun al-Rashid, whose name means the just, the upright, the rightly guided. And he has a good run from 786 to 809, and he has two sons. Well, he decides to do something that causes some trouble. And he appoints both of his sons, or at least two of his more prominent sons. He probably had many sons. But he names two of his sons as his heirs. One is the senior, one is the junior. So the junior one is appointed to kind of rule in the east and be kind of waiting in the wings until the other son, leaves the throne vacant. Well, this is a recipe for disaster. So these brothers, after their father passes, they go to war. Because the one that becomes the caliph becomes a guy by the name of Al-Amin, which means the trustworthy. He doesn't rule for that long. He goes from 809 to 813, because in 811, he starts a war. He starts the fourth fitna, the fourth civil war. And we get yet again another kind of east-west fight. Well, he fails, and his brother defeats him at the siege of Baghdad a couple years later in 813, and captures and kills him. And then he ascends to become the seventh Abbasid Caliph named Al-Mamun. And that is the name meaning the reliable, and he has a good 20-year run. And we have some very significant thing, and there's a lot of prosperity that begins to happen under him. One of the most notable things is something I mentioned at the beginning of the video, and that is the House of Wisdom, which is kind of similar to the Library of Alexandria. So up until this point, the caliphs had a private library that, of course, they've been storing books, scrolls, they got scholars working there, all that stuff. Well, under Al-Mamun, this gets a huge expansion, and it's open to the public. So it goes from a private library into a public research and translation center. So they start from all over the place. They start collecting all these different texts. Texts from Greek, Persian, Indian, and other texts were rendered into Arabic, and then they began to make advancements. They began to study them and improve and make some breakthroughs, particularly in the fields of mathematics as they start to develop algebra, medicine, astronomy, optics, and philosophy, among other things. So there's a lot of ancient knowledge that was preserved, as well as some original breakthroughs. And I wish this really deserves its own video, possibly its own series of videos. We're not going to talk about it anytime soon, and I don't, unfortunately, have much time to go much deeper on it. But there were some big-name philosophers, one of them being Avicenna, who, at least how we know him in the West. And theology is another field that gets some attention, too. So we even see things like the... what do you call it? I believe it's the moral argument for God. Not the moral, cosmological argument, I believe, for God. Or some other arguments that even Christians today use, got their start with some of the scholars at this point in time. Well, this is a remarkable project that continues on. And actually, a lot of the works from, for example, like ancient Greece and Rome are things that are brought here to preserve them and then translate them into Arabic, and then eventually they make their way to the West. And that is kind of the way that they get preserved. So a lot of the, I believe a lot of the old like Greek epics and stuff like that were preserved that way. No, you're not going crazy. I did in fact have a change of scenery there. I was getting some pedestrians out there gawking at me and giving me strange looks for just sitting off to the side of a building, talking to myself. So also under Al-Mamun, you have something going on. So I should note one thing about the Umayyads is they rapidly expanded the caliphate, but they kind of overextended themselves, and it was very hard to control, and that's why you get a lot of this, like, the center against the periphery kind of tension happening. So one thing that happens, obviously Muslim Spain has broken off, and they are under the surviving Umayyad control. Well, you get some other regions popping up here that become kind of independent or semi-independent, but they are also still oriented towards the Abbasid Caliphate proper. So an example of that is the Aghlabids. I'm sure I'm probably mispronouncing that. There's a lot of ids that we're going to be talking about. You got the Umayyads, you got the Abbasids, you got the Aghlabids, you got all kinds of ids all over the place. Well, basically it's referring usually to a dynasty or a power of some sort. So the Aghlabids are from kind of central North Africa, and so they are vassals. So they're allies of the Abbasids, and at this time of Al-Mamun, the 8th caliph, they team up and they go to war. And they conquer Crete, the island, the Greek island of Crete, sometime between the year of 824 and 827. Oh, I'm sorry, I think Crete was the Abbasids only, but then they do team up and begin to conquer Sicily. So this starts in 827, kind of getting late in his rule. He passes away in 833, and it takes a while for this to be completed. However, at some point they do completely conquer Sicily. So Sicily comes fully under Muslim control. Yeah, I bet you didn't know that Sicily once upon a time was ruled by the Muslims. Other notable places that particularly the Aghlabids conquered was Malta in the year 870 and portions of southern Italy. So there was little pockets on the actual Italian mainland that were controlled and ruled by Muslims. And it's thought that they even may have conquered Sardinia, although I guess, I don't know how much, I was going to say architecture. What's the word I'm looking for? Archaeology. I don't know if they've had particular archaeological finds that support that. It seemed to be kind of in doubt. They believe they may have just been heavily raiding Sardinia. But they also conducted raids on the city of Rome, of all places, in the year 846. They sacked Old St. Peter's and St. Paul's outside the wall. So those are two very significant churches in Christendom, and they are sacked. They are desecrated by the Muslim raiders, and this marks the beginning of intensifying warfare between the Muslim powers and now the more Western Christians, not just the East. We'll talk a little bit more about warfare here in a bit, but something else interesting that happens is there's this thing called the Mina, the Mina, between the years 833 and 851. This is a kind of like a Spanish Inquisition, but like before the Spanish Inquisition, and it's Muslim style. So this is Muslim on Muslim conflict here, and it's basically those who are in power who are trying to root out those who are unorthodox. So there's a lot of development of theology going on in this era, and I won't cover all these different movements. This was just the only one I wanted to note here. And they would stop Muslims and non-Muslims alike and force them to agree to specific theology, and to get them to admit that, like, you know, the Quran was created, for example, or that the Quran was uncreated. It was always eternal with Allah. Things like that become points of a lot of division. And just like early Christendom had a lot of division over certain theological issues, like with the identity and nature of Christ, Islam is kind of going through its own period like that, where there's a lot of hammering out the specific details of theology, of what is orthodoxy and what is not. Then getting a little later in this golden era peak, you have the 8th, I may have gotten the count wrong there, but you have one named Al-Mutasim, which means he who seeks refuge in God. I think he might be the 9th, actually. Yeah, because he takes over in 833. So he's the 9th. Typo there, sorry. And he does something noteworthy here by establishing the Turkic Gilman in positions of power. So Gilman are slave soldiers. Slave soldiers are a thing that is not uncommon in Islamic history. They are used extensively from the 9th century, so the 800s, all the way through the 1800s. They're used for a long time, and they're pretty much used in Muslim forces more than anywhere else in the world in all of history. Well, these Gilman are actually given some significant power. And he uses these guys. They're outside soldiers is what you should think. It's not just slaves, it's also mercenaries. But he brings these basically outsiders in to serve as his personal guard and to kind of replace, probably growing suspicious of those who might be his potential rivals. And so this becomes a new normal, and it becomes also a source of chaos because in 836, remember, Samarra is founded and the capital moves there. Well, then there begins this whole era around that time of a bunch of assassinations. Oh, no, sorry, that's in the 860s. But yeah, so this is a big turning point because of what we're about to talk about in the next era, is the decline in the general fragmentation of the caliphate here. And this is going to take us from 861 all the way through the end of what is generally considered the proper, true end of the Abbasid Caliphate. But we'll discuss very briefly this kind of like limp to the next major caliphate, which is the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Caliphate. So this is an era of central authority eroding as regional dynasties begin to rise, and the caliphs they lose more and more power to eventually basically just become figureheads for the most part. Well, there's a specific term here in the mid-800s that begins to come into use, and that is the term sultan. You may have heard this term before. We've mentioned that Islam is pretty much impossible to entirely separate from politics. The way that the faith is built, wherever you see Islam, you see Sharia, and Sharia is meant to not just govern the Islamic community, the church, the Muslim version of the church, but it's really meant properly to guide all of society, and naturally that's going to involve the local civil authorities as well. So, but you do get a little bit of an idea of kind of the separation of powers to a degree, with caliphs being more religious and symbolic figureheads, and while still at least nominally being the true leader of the Muslim world. But then you get the sultans, which is a title that's given to powerful military leaders or powerful rulers that are usually regional leaders, and they're generally thought to be like deputies kind of to the caliph. Well, like I said, these guys are the ones that are really the power in the caliphate from about this point forward. So this is starting to grow. You start to kind of get some overlap between this beginning to happen and these, mercenary armies that are being used more and more. And they are, like I said, it's not a religious title. Sultan is a more earthly, temporal title. They wield more earthly authority, but they are not independent. This is not a separation of church and state per se, because they are still subordinate to the caliph. They still technically take their orders from the caliph, even though the caliph really doesn't have any means to back up their orders, because probably beyond their personal guard, they don't really have much power. It doesn't happen all at once, but it does progressively happen. So you start to get some of these. I mentioned the anarchy, the period of assassination. So you get this new personal guard rolling in. It's up. The capital's up in Samarra, and from about 861 to 870, you have multiple assassinations going on. Power quickly moving around from caliph to caliph, and the dynasty's just getting weaker and weaker. And this is when a lot of that power begins to shift to these sultans that are, governors, I guess is another way you could think of them as well. Well, another power eventually rises. So today, if you know anything about today's kind of landscape of Muslim nations, two big ones you're probably aware of is, of course, the nation of Iran, and not just because it's very prominent in the news right now, but also Iran is the foremost, most powerful predominantly Shia Muslim government, Shia Muslim power in the world. Then you have Saudi Arabia, which is really kind of the foremost Sunni Muslim. Remember, Sunnis make up about 85 to 90% of all Muslims in the world, and Sunni make up most of the rest. Well, you kind of have that rivalry stretching all the way back into this period. So obviously the seeds were laid with the first disagreements over who should take over after Muhammad when Ali was not winning the elections, but other people were. That's kind of the beginnings of it. Well, what started as kind of a political disagreement over the last about 200-300 years at this point have led to slowly but steadily growing religious, theological differences as well. So it is still, they're still Muslim, but there's beginning to be more difference here. And there is such a difference that the Fatimid Caliphate comes into being in North. So they succeed eventually the Abbasids that I mentioned earlier. So kind of that region, what today is kind of Libya. So they declare themselves in 909, and they are a Shia Caliphate. So the Abbasids are the Sunni Caliphate. They are now a Shia Caliphate. So now you have this like almost Saudi Arabia, Iran type rivalry between these two. And they are a real thorn in the side for a good long while here. And they begin to advance eastward until they eventually conquer Egypt. And then they take over portions of Syria, what today we recognize as the Holy Land. And even at one point, they stretch down and conquer and control Mecca and Medina. So they have a good little stretch of territory there. And actually, when the Crusades finally happen, it is the Fatimids that are one of the major groups that... So you get the Seljuk Turks, and I know I'm throwing a lot of terms at you here, but the Fatimids are one of the ones that are in a lot of battles against the Crusaders, the Christian Crusaders. Well, they're going to continue on until about the 1100s, late 1100s. Meanwhile, out in the west, so the Emirate of Cordoba has now been declared its own caliphate. So now we have 3 caliphates on the board. You have the Abbasids, which are the main one. You have the Fatimids, which are the rival one. And now you have another kind of rival, kind of independent one, which is now not the Emirate, but the Caliphate of Cordoba in 929. And they will continue this for just over 100 years until they kind of dissolve into a bunch of kingdoms that are eventually all reclaimed by the Spanish Reconquista. But that is a very slow, steady process. Now to finish this out, we're going to go through these next couple centuries very quickly. So you have this other group in Iran called the Buyids. Well, they pop up and they conquer Baghdad. They walk into Baghdad and take over. And they keep the Abbasids in the Abbasid dynasty in power, but basically take all their power. So now they're in control as of the year 945. So things are just getting worse and worse for the Abbasids. But then you have another group come in that I mentioned just a minute ago. Another group comes in from the east, northeast, called the Seljuk Turks. So at this point, the Seljuks had become Muslims. So they were Muslims when they arrived on the scene. But they take over, they conquer Baghdad and take over from the Buyids in 1055. So now the Seljuks are basically ruled by a sultan. They have their own sultanate, right? I think. I'm sorry. But they have their own leaders, and they continue this practice where the Abbasid Caliph is left in power as the true, leader of all Muslims. But it's really at this point the Seljuks who are the true holders of, political and especially military power. So they from this point forward become the military wing of the Abbasid Caliphate, and they also will fight against the Crusaders a lot and go to war with the Eastern Roman Empire a lot. And one big battle of note here that they fight is the Battle of Manzikert in the year 1071. So this is a little bit after they have their kind of alliance with the Abbasids, and they defeat the Eastern Romans. They crush them in the Battle of Manzikert, and this really is a huge loss for the Christians and is kind of a major domino that leads up to the launching of the First Crusade, which is the next era. So up until this point, if you notice, we've talked about a lot of history, and as we'll discuss in a little bit more detail about wars at the end here, in the concepts discussion, the Crusades are something. So Islam has basically been at constant war against the Eastern Romans, the Eastern Christians, this whole time. They start this process of just regular raids. It may not always be a major war going on, but at least once a year, typically, if not more than once a year, there are regular raids that are staged to just go and plunder, to just go and, take some plunder, take some captives, and go back to their side of the border for a while. And this continues on. It goes by land, it goes by sea. This happens for hundreds of years. Well, the Seljuks come in and they, now that the Abbasids are no longer really the military force, they continue this practice. So all these other groups, even though the Abbasids may be kind of receding in their power, all these other groups are continuing this practice of raiding and attacking and things like that into Christendom. And to be fair, Christendom has counterattacks too. They have counter raids as well too. It's not that it's completely, unprovoked, but there's this momentum all the way back from Muhammad, this steady advance against Christendom, and they continue to attack and raid and plunder Christians. So, but as we mentioned, the Aghlabids were starting to attack Christian Italy, which is a more Western, because that's where Rome is. And then you have the Umayyads out west that are continuing to push into Spain and France. Well, I guess at this point they're slowly losing ground. This is beginning to get the attention of Western Christians because the Seljuks are making it very difficult for Christian pilgrims to move down to Jerusalem. So what happens is Pope Urban II has had enough. And so he begins to call for the First Crusade and makes a big speech, gets everybody riled up, and gets a lot of Christians, which had not really been done since the Roman Empire, but gets a lot of Christians to more or less put their differences aside, because you've got these different kingdoms in Europe, particularly Western Europe, and they begin to throw their lot in together, and they march eastward to help their Eastern Christian brethren, which at this point there was the Great Schism going on, so there's some tension there as well. But they ride to the aid of the Eastern Christians, and in 1096, the First Crusade is launched. There's kind of a minor, like a People's Crusade, which is just a bunch of peasants that get together and they end up getting slaughtered by the Muslim armies. But then you have the proper First Crusade come in about 1096, and it's really the only one. There's about 9 that happen over the course of the next 200 years. So this period goes from about 1095 until 1291, and it's kind of just a back and forth. It unites a lot of the divisions in Islam, at least to a point, as they, ride to meet this threat. But what happens is the Christians come through and they reclaim a bunch of the land for first the Eastern Romans, and then they set up 4 Crusader states. So Edessa in the north, Antioch, I believe, and then I forget the third one, but then the last one is the Kingdom of Jerusalem. So these are Western leaders, Western Christian leaders that have taken up rulership of these different places. And they are a thorn in the side of the caliphate, I guess at this point, the various caliphates, for a good almost 200 years. So there's a lot of... It's not just that the Christians came out of nowhere and decided to pick on the helpless Muslims. No, there was a good about, let's call it 630, when there was the first kind of bad blood, the first battles between Muslims and Christians, all the way until 1095, 1096. So what is that? That's at least 400 years. It's about 450 years of bloodshed, where Christians are on the defensive before the First Crusade is launched. So, just a little food for thought. But after that, they are eventually expelled, but before they are entirely expelled, there is a major event that happens, and that is the Mongol Empire comes into the region. That is the sack of Baghdad at the hands of the Mongols. So this happens in 1258. They absolutely devastate the city. They destroy the House of Wisdom. It's said that there was so many scrolls and works that were thrown into the river that it turned the river for a time black with ink. And then they also kill the Caliph and all the family there. Just absolutely devastate Baghdad. And that is functionally the end of the Abbasids. That's the end of their real power. Even though a couple years later, so the Fatimids, in 1171, you get this famous Islamic general by the name of Saladin. He comes in and topples the Fatimids and reclaims what was the Fatimid Caliphate for the Abbasids, and they appoint him as Sultan, so it becomes a Sultanate, known as the Ayyubid Sultanate. So he rules it for a bit, and then it passes on to a couple other leaders until about 1250. Then there's this caste called the Mamluks, so they are technically slave soldiers, but they become kind of this ruling class now. So they overthrow the Ayyubids. Are you keeping track of all this transition of power? About 1250, well, when Baghdad falls in 1258, they see a chance to kind of legitimize themselves. So they actually, through a cadet branch, a subordinate branch of the Abbasid dynasty, they set them up as the caliphs and reestablished them in 1261. And this continues on, kind of the same arrangement where the Mamluks have the real power, but the Abbasids are the religious figurehead. And this continues on into the 1500s when the Ottomans finally roll in 1517. They conquer Cairo, and with it they take the status of the legitimate caliphate. That is about it for the primary history lesson. So let's, before we get out of here, because it's getting late in the day here, and it's getting late in this video, let's talk about a couple of topics, and then we will wrap up for this video for today. The first thing I would like to discuss are the Sunni schools of jurisprudence. We discussed this in a previous video where we discussed the Hanafi school and the Maliki school, which began to form, at least the body of work that produced them began to be formed under the Umayyads, with scholars that lived during those times, with Abu Hanifa, who it's named after, dying in 767, and Malik ibn Anas dying in 795. So if you don't remember much, the main thing about those was under the Hanafi school. So these are both huge schools today and govern most Muslims in the world between these two schools. The Hanafi school, and they're both kind of more flexible, but the Hanafi school is probably the most flexible, and a particularly distinguishing characteristic of it is that it takes in kind of local customs and traditions into account, as long as they mesh with the Quran, the Sunnah, all that. And this is found in Turkey today, Central Asia, Southern Asia, in places like Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, parts of Iraq and Egypt, as well as a lot of diaspora communities throughout the world. The Maliki school, which was developed in Medina, is also its distinguishing characteristic there. So it takes into account the traditions and the customs of the people of Medina, because the scholar living there reasoned that they were the most direct living connection to Muhammad himself. So their customs and traditions were kind of a living example of how the Prophet would have lived, to reinforce the Sunnah. So that is what is unique about that particular school. Again, that's the Maliki school, which is most commonly found in North and West Africa and parts of Egypt and Sudan. Next, we have the last two major schools of Sunni Islam, which came into being during the early Abbasid era. And the first of those is the Shafi'i school, which was founded by Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i, who died in 820, and he actually studied under the previous scholar, Malik, and others as well. But this one and the next one are both more strict schools. So the first two were a little more flexible. These next two are increasingly strict. So this one is strict. The next one is more strict. The most strict, in fact. But this one is a little less. It prioritizes the Quran, Sunnah, consensus, and analogy, but has a lot less of a reliance on reason and local customs. So it's starting to tighten up shop a little bit, and it's found today mostly in Southeastern Asia, so Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, in Eastern Africa, in Somalia, Kenya, and Tanzania, Yemen, parts of Egypt, and southern India. And finally, we have the smallest of the 4 schools, the Hanbali school, named after Ahmad ibn Hanbal, who died in 855, in Baghdad. And this is the most strict of all the schools. It is the most text literalist. It prioritizes the Quran and the Hadith over just about everything else. It has a strong emphasis on avoiding innovation, and it has influenced something particularly of note, which is the Wahhabi school of thought, or the Wahhabi movement. And if that doesn't ring a bell, it's actually the body of thought there or the body of theology there, that has resulted in groups like Al-Qaeda. So it has produced some pretty extreme or pretty fundamentalist groups that have caused a lot of problems for the West, and really for Arabs as well, for a lot of the Muslim world as well, but particularly for us here in the West. And it is the smallest of the 4, found today primarily in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and some of the Gulf areas. So that is, in a very brief overview there, that is the 4 major Sunni schools. We're not going to talk about the Shia schools. We could, but we're just quite frankly running out of time, and they don't affect as many people, so we're going to move on. I was originally going to go into a little more detail. I think I've talked about the conflicts enough, so just recall that there was more or less a constant state of tension, if not outright war, between the Caliphate and their bordering lands, not just Christendom, but especially Christendom, and in particular, the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, took really the bulk of that, the brunt of that. A little bit in the West with Spain being under Muslim control, but a lot of that was halted after the Battle of Tours, where they halted the advance into France. But there was, some coastal raiding going on. Italy had a lot of problems. We just mentioned Sicily was conquered earlier, as well as some other regions. But just know that these raids were very common. They went on all the time. Some were bigger, some were smaller. Certain battles did occur, or wars did break out here and there. But it was usually, could be expected there would at least be raids for a number of things. Number 1, plunder. So they're always seeking more treasure and riches. Number 2 is captives. And we'll get to that again here in just a minute. Number 3 is to get tribute, to force those on the borderlands to pay tribute. And number 4 would be for weakening particularly the Eastern Roman defenses, or number 5, just asserting dominance. So, yeah, so the core dynamic was more adversarial between the Abbasids and their neighbors, particularly with Eastern Rome. But this did shift a bit. Well, I mean, it kind of remained that way, but it wasn't so much the Abbasids specifically doing that, because remember, the Buyids took over in the 900s, and then the Turks, the Seljuk Turks, took over in the 1000s. And they continued this state of affairs for the most part. It just wasn't the Abbasids always directly doing so. But a concept I did want to spend a minute talking about is Dar al-Islam versus Dar al-Harb. And if you don't know what that is, it's terms that translate to the abode or the house of Islam and the abode or house of war. And basically it's the whole, there are 2 kinds of people, but there are 2 kinds of lands. There is the lands in which Islam reigns, which Islam controls to some form, and there are the lands that it does not, where it is the place of war, where it will be subject to future conquests. So these terms specifically don't appear in the Quran or the Sunnah, but they were created by the early jurists, so the different schools, the guys that were founding the different schools that we just talked about. They created these concepts because it was to help kind of regulate and build a system for Islamic rulers, Islamic armies, and really Muslims in general, to fall back on to understand how they are to interact with their neighbors with, conflicts here on into the future. So the different jurists largely agreed on a lot of these ideas here, and they govern things such as rules about trade, about travel, particularly about jihad, contracts, and security. So the primary developer, though, is Abu Hanifa, founder of the Hanifa school, which is, remember, the largest school today. And the core idea is this. So the Dar al-Islam refers to lands under Muslim rule where Islamic law, Sharia, generally prevails and Muslims enjoy security. There you go. The Dar al-Harb refers to non-Muslim ruled lands where the default relationship is viewed as one of potential conflict or expansion until Islam's dominance can be achieved, though temporary truces were allowed. So these binary divisions became the common mainstream view among classical Sunni jurists, and this is still a view that's widely held today, although they don't necessarily talk about it a lot. We'll get into that in future videos as well. That'll factor into my ultimate conclusions. But some key commands and rulings here is that it's the duty of the Muslim ruler to wage offensive jihad, not just defensive, offensive jihad, to bring the Dar al-Harb under Islamic sovereignty when feasible. That's a key term. And the reason why is Islam is a universal faith. It is seen as the proper state of the entire world. So they want to continue to expand Islam's control until it controls the whole world. Although hostilities are not mandatory at all times. So it doesn't have to be a perpetual state of war. In fact, there is room left for temporary armistices or treaties. And usually the standard was about 10 years at most. That was to give time to regroup, rearm, retrain, and get ready for the next push. However, informal long-term peace was common. So it wasn't that, and again, keep in mind that these raids do occur, but it doesn't necessarily kick off a whole new war or a whole new wave of expansion. So in the opposite Abbasid era, expansion has slowed significantly more than it did under the Umayyad era. Some other things to be aware of, so some of the interactions, for example, that it governs are, it allows Muslims to travel, trade, and reside within areas that are considered the abode of war, but to do so with caution. There are some exceptions specifically within the Hanafi school that you should be aware of. So certain prohibitions like riba, which is interest or charging interest, with non-Muslims may not strictly apply according to the Hanafi school. The other three schools are a little more strict and kind of more advocate for a general application of Sharia, the same everywhere, whether it's within the lands of Islam or within the lands of war. But the Hanafi school, which is the largest school today, has this precedent where certain things that are prohibited in Islamic lands may not be prohibited in the lands of war. And they use a relatively minor example there, but I have at least concerns, because I think there's a lot of things we see today that can kind of explain why we see these things happening, but don't necessarily see them happening in a place like Saudi Arabia, for example. We'll get to that later. And then another key thing here is prisoners of war could be turned into slaves. This is a major source of slavery in captives from the abode of war. So, but the rules for jihad still apply, which includes, no harming non-combatants, women, children, clergy, etc., unless they fight. And safety guarantees, if people surrender or cities surrender, must be honored. Those are the ideals. However, especially at the beginning, you're dealing with people that were very tribal. They had only ever been, so there wasn't always a lot of discipline. And even though those were the ideals, there were many, many, many violations. There were many people that were executed that are technically prohibited from receiving that treatment. There's a lot of people that were brutalized that technically should not have been. However, I should note, in the interest of fairness, that this was not exclusive to the Islamic armies. During the Crusades, in particular during the Siege of Jerusalem, when the First Crusade came in, once the Crusaders broke inside, thousands were slaughtered. And that included many non-combatants as well as combatants. So the Muslim armies certainly were not the only ones to do this, but yeah, it is what it is. So as the Caliphate has expanded and taken over new lands, they had to decide what to do with the people that already lived there, that did not want to convert and become Muslims. And we know from previous videos that Christians, Jews, sometimes Zoroastrians, and a couple others had the opportunity, known as people of the book, had the opportunity to accept becoming dhimmis. So whenever the Muslim army would move into an area, they would offer the three choices, which was convert to Islam, submit, surrender, and pay the jizya. And pretty soon after that came a system of rules as well. It wasn't just about paying the special tax, it was a number of regulations as well. Or fight, and most likely die. So, sorry, nose itching there. Dhimmis, this existed as long as Islam began to expand. Really was enforced in the Umayyad era, and it continued into the Abbasid era. So this definitely was a practice that continued on. And essentially it means these people that are dhimmis are second-class citizens. In the case of, like we talked about, the difference between the tension earlier, at least under the Umayyads, between the Arab Muslims and the non-Arab converts to Islam, it almost makes them a third class because the non-Arab converts were kind of a second class in and of themselves. But with the Abbasids, those first two become kind of more one in the same class. But dhimmis remain a second-class citizen. Now, I will say that there was more consideration given to merit for a lot of positions. Some dhimmis did pretty well for themselves. A lot of them worked as pretty high-level administrators or even scholars or a number of merchants even. So a lot of them had a lot of success and had a lot of, didn't live such bad lives. But this was not always a guarantee. So the system of dhimmitude was in force across the Caliphate and across other Muslim lands, but it wasn't always enforced equally, universally. Certain areas you might be more lenient. Certain areas it might be more strict and more harsh and suck a lot more. And there were sometimes instances where there would be things like pogroms would break out, usually when it was times of things being harder, tough economic conditions, wars and whatnot. Sometimes the dhimmis would have it taken out, frustrations taken out on them. And just to remind you a few of those restrictions that dhimmis had to endure. So, paying the jizya was one, and it's not always defined exactly what that is. It was kind of up to the rulers to decide or up to the jurists to decide. But that did allow you to be exempted from military service, so you weren't subject to be called up whenever there was a time of conflict. And you were generally also protected from being made a slave, which was still worse than being a dhimmi. However, you did have restrictions to your places of worship. So there was no building new churches or synagogues, monasteries or convents. A lot of times you could not repair old ones or ruined ones. And there was no public religious practices. So you couldn't publicly display your crosses, Bibles, religious symbols, or books on Muslim streets at the very least. No loud prayers, no church bells, no processions, no public proclamations, and especially no proselytizing to Muslims. Oftentimes they had to dress differently. Sometimes the different dhimmis had to dress differently. So the Jews would dress one way, Christians another. Sometimes you'd have to have the front of your hair shaved, and you had to use different transportation. So you couldn't ride horses or camels. You had to ride donkeys, and you couldn't ride them normally. Typically you had to ride with your legs over, side saddle. You couldn't speak like Muslims. You couldn't name your kids after the manner of Muslims. You couldn't stop your kids from becoming Muslims if they wanted to do so. You always had to defer to Muslims. So if they walked in, if you're sitting there eating a meal somewhere and a Muslim wanted your seat, you had to get up and give him your seat. If you're walking down the street, you had to stay out of the way of Muslims, and a number of other things as well. So it was all about, and again, those all weren't always enforced everywhere all the time. Think of it kind of like, so the Romans, when they persecuted Christians, it wasn't always a empire-wide, always torturing Christians at all times kind of thing. A lot of it was regional. Some regions were worse, some regions were better. And there were times of general persecution of Christians, and other times there were times of more tolerance. Similar here, where sometimes it was more harsh. So generally they were tolerated, but different degrees of tolerance. Sometimes it was hell to be a dhimmi. Other times it wasn't so bad, but you definitely were never equal with a Muslim. And if you stepped out of line and violated those different rules to any degrees, your protection was gone. And you would generally be regarded as a pagan, which would generally mean your life was forfeit. But still, that leaves one class of society that we have to discuss, which is our final topic today. And that is, sorry, I know that was really bright. Slavery! Today's topic, slavery. We're going to finish out on a high note, right? Well, slavery was unfortunately a regular practice. The Quran makes room for it. The Sunnah makes room for it. It was practiced since the time of Muhammad, and it was practiced under the Umayyads, and it continued to be practiced under the Abbasids. And they pulled slaves. As we mentioned before, one major source of slaves was the abode of war. Well, most of your source of slaves was the abode of war. So generally, you could not make a Muslim a slave, and generally, you could not make dhimmis slaves. But if you had captured people during a conflict out on the borderlands or just on a raid, there were raids going out as far as like Iceland. Or you could also purchase them. There were some exchanges between Vikings. They'd be selling them slaves as well. But slavery was very common, and it was used for different purposes. So male slaves tended to be used for agricultural or field labor. But there were also some slaves that didn't have it as bad. And a lot of these were your military slaves. So some definitely, were fighting against their will. But others, such as the Mamluks or some of these Turks, actually could kind of have a little social mobility. And you could, in the case of the Mamluks, they became the ruling class of Egypt, at least at one time. Other male slaves were used for domestic work. Some were used as eunuchs to protect harems and perform administrative functions, and so on. And that brings up something that is kind of a dark note, and that is that it was not uncommon to castrate your male slaves. And that created a pretty high mortality rate when the slaves were first entering Muslim lands. Sometimes as high as like 50-60% would die in the procedure. And unfortunately, there were female slaves were pretty common and highly sought after because a lot of them weren't just used as domestic servants, but they were used as concubines. Yes, the Islamic caliphates commonly practiced sexual slavery. So a lot of them would be brought to the rulers or elites who would purchase them if they weren't just given to them as the spoils of war. And it was permitted. There was an unlimited, by the Quran and the Sunnah, they did not put limits on how many female slaves. So a Muslim man could typically only have 4 wives, but he could have as many slaves as he could provide for. Now, slaves in general did have certain rights. They did have a level of, personhood recognized. And children of a Muslim and a female slave were regarded as free and had all the rights of a free person, but, there it is. There was even slave revolts. So there's something called the Zanj Rebellion that broke out in for a while. I didn't read that one real in depth there, but from 869 to 883, which took place in Basra, or around Basra. So it was a A lot of the kind of agricultural slaves had an uprising. A lot of the slaves from East Africa there. Some of the big sources where they came from, as I just mentioned, was East Africa, from the Turkic region where they got a lot of their military slaves, and from Europe, particularly from the Slavic regions in Eastern and Southeastern Europe. But as we mentioned, sometimes they did pull them from Spain, from France, from Italy, from, deeper in as far as they could send their raids, even all the way up to Iceland at times. And then even Nubia, which was Sudan, the area of Sudan. They had some from there as well. So all sorts of places. They even had some from way out west. They would take Berber slaves. From way out east, they would take Indian slaves. They came from all over the place. So the slave trade was thriving under Islam. And in fact, that would remain the case, well, to this very day. So now there's a lot more restrictions, but they really didn't. Well, we'll get more into that as we talk about the Ottomans, because that's when they start to kind of put restrictions on the trade. But it did exist all the way through all of the caliphates, and a lot of Muslim lands to this day have slavery in different forms. It's not always as obvious. It's a little more hidden, but it is in fact still something that is practiced. But there it is. Thank you very much for joining me today. I tried to keep it under an hour. I don't think I succeeded this time. We'll see in the final compilation here, but I really appreciate you guys watching if you've made it this far. Again, please like, comment, subscribe, follow me on X. Tell me how I did. In any case, check out these videos here that I'm going to put as a recommendation to you. And we're going to continue this on. We've now covered the largest era. We're going to talk about the Ottomans next time. That's going to be, I'm switching this up to every other week until we get through these major videos. Once I'm done with the Islam series, I'm going to really focus on just more bite-sized videos. I think something that hurts me in this channel is I make such long videos, and I'm not well established yet. So you don't know me. You don't know who I am. You don't know what I have to offer. And that's okay, because I'm no expert. So I don't have any credentials to throw at you, and I certainly don't have a lot of production value right now. But in any case, God bless you guys. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.